Hello, everybody. It's Friday, the 22nd of January, 2021. Welcome back to Civil War Chat. Today's topic is going to be Andrew Jackson and President Biden's decision to remove Jackson's portrait from the Oval Office. Before I get started, those of you that want to be notified of future episodes of Civil War Chat, be sure to click the notification bell in the upper right, and it'll put you in the queue to be notified whenever we have a new show. So uh, with that, let me pull up my notes and I'll get started. I can think of a number of reasons why uh, Biden should leave Andrew Jackson's portrait in the Oval Office. And so let me just get started with listing some. One, first, he was the first commoner to become president after a string of six aristocrats in the White House. His 1829 inauguration was unprecedented. 10,000 people, mostly commoners, attended, many from the West and South. According to eyewitness Margaret Bayard Smith, the crowd that followed him from the Capitol to the White House was composed of, quote, countrymen, farmers, gentlemen, women and children, black and white, close quote. The White House was open to all, including black Americans. Smith concluded, quote, it was the people's day and the people's president and the people would rule. And that is an important point. I mean, the Democrat Party was supposed to be representing the commoners. And even today they claim that. Jackson was the first commoner elected to the White House, elected to the presidency. The first, all before, whether they were North or South, they were all aristocrats. So let me just continue. If not for Jackson's president, well, I've already made that point. Second, even though a Southerner, Jackson stopped South Carolina from seceding in 1832 in a dispute over high tariffs, which the North favored but the South opposed. He persuaded Congress to modify the tariff and simultaneously grant him authority to militarily enforce it in South Carolina. The Palmetto State accepted the compromise in 1833. Third, Jackson was America's most fiscally responsible president. He was the only one to completely repay the federal debt. He eliminated wasteful spending and fired corrupt tax assessors for collecting personal bribes instead of taxes. Fourth, he stopped private interest from monopolizing money when he ended the Second Bank of the United States, which had functioned as the nation's central bank. Since it was privately owned, however, the government chose only 5 of its 25 directors, and its stockholders elected the rest. And Jackson explained, quote, it is easy to conceive that great evils might flow from such a concentration of power in the hands of a few men with no responsibility to the people, having no responsibility to the people. The rich and powerful too often bend the acts of the government to their selfish purposes, close quote. I mean, come on, that was what, 190 years ago he says that? And now the Democrats say that's their newfound principle. Fifth, Jackson presciently recognized the dangers of a deep state composed of perpetual office holders. He proposed term limits for elected officials and replaced about 15% of the bureaucrats who had been appointed by earlier administrations. He felt that, quote, rotation of office, close quote, rather than permanent tenure should be the principle in a democracy, not the exception. No Joe Biden who lives 50 years in the same position. No, we need to rotate our offices. That was his principle. Joe Biden, of course, violates that, and that's how he got to the White House, simply through being a crony to the party as it evolved. Jackson continued, there are, he said, few men who can for any great length of time enjoy office and power without being under the influence of feelings unfavorable to the faithful discharge of their public duties. They are apt to acquire a habit of looking with indifference upon the public interest. Oh, quote, there could hardly be a quote more suitable for Joe Biden. His whole career was as a politician. That was all he was concerned with. His success, moving up in terms of politics. from one office to another for greater and ever greater political power. Nothing else. Sixth, General Jackson's victories General Jackson's victories during the War of 1812 against the British and their Indian allies transformed him into a second George Washington. According to biographer Robert Remini, quote, the nation had entered this war in part to prove its right to independence. See, at this time, Europe, yeah, we had won the War of Independence, but the European powers looked at that, well, we could still beat those guys if we really wanted to, and we'll just wait until there's an important need to take over those states again, and we'll do it. But here's what Robert Remini, the biographer of Jackson, says. The nation had entered this war in part to prove its right to independence, but had experienced one military disaster after another, including the burning of the nation's capital. Jackson restored America's confidence that our country was not merely a temporary experiment in democracy. What an accomplishment. Joe Biden and all his acolytes haven't done anything like that. While some claim that Jackson's victory at New Orleans was unimportant because a preliminary treaty already had been signed in Europe, ending the war, Jackson's infliction of more than 2,000 casualties at a cost of fewer than 100 at the Battle of New Orleans convinced Europeans that future wars against the United States of America could be more dangerous than previously assumed. As a result, 6 years later, Spain agreed to sell Florida to the United States in order to end persistent conflicts with General Jackson along the peninsula's northern border. Although some modern critics complain that Jackson should be dishonored because he was a slaveholder, historian H.W. Brands of the University of Texas explains in his book, quote, Andrew Jackson in his life and times, quote, the northern states had abandoned slavery peacefully when a majority of the voters there decided that slavery no longer served their interest. When a majority of voters in the southern states decided the same thing, slavery would end in the South. To force the issue was to assert that the people couldn't be trusted with political powers. And that's something Jackson could never accept, close quote. Yeah, but see, today, the Democrat Party, the elite Democrat Party, wants to re-educate people that disagree with them because they don't think we could be trusted to have political powers. They feel that we must be reprogrammed. Jackson would never accept that, and neither will I. Finally, I'd like to explain that this issue of slavery, the Northerners, particularly the Northerners in the Democrat Party, but including the Republican Party, have a wrong impression about the Civil War in the context of slavery. They simply said, well, the South had slaves, so they were fighting to perpetuate slavery. But the 1860 Republican Party platform said specifically what they wanted was to prevent the expansion of slaves into the Western territories. Now, in that context, slaves was proved to be a euphemism. What they really wanted to do was to prevent the migration of blacks into the Western territories, because they knew that the future of the Western territories would determine the future of the country, and they did not want blacks in the Western territories. Some of the Lincoln, Seward, and other leading Republicans flatly said they wanted the Western territories for whites, but they generally said so in the context of we don't want slaves there. If they truly wanted to free the slaves, why didn't they make some arrangements for the massive transformation that would have to occur, going from people that were told what to do to people that needed to take care of themselves? Even the Tsar of Russia did a better job. We had 4 million slaves here. There was no plan upon freeing them to take care of them. None. You know, Lincoln himself even admitted the reason for the Emancipation Proclamation was because it was a war measure done for the purpose of winning the war. And at the time that he first proposed it in August 1862, it was clearly a big worry in his mind and in the minds of many others in his party and at the North. They were about to lose the Civil War. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation was for, to avoid losing the war. Then, compared to what the Tsar of Russia had done, we had 4 million blacks here in the United States, 3.5 million slaves. Russia had 20 million serfs. The Tsar said, we need to free them. Let's take some time to figure out how we're going to do it. And what they did, I don't think it was, and I don't have all the details in my head right now, but it was about 5 years. They worked out a plan of gradual compensated emancipation. So what essentially happened is the landowners sold the land to the state. The state gave the land to the serfs. 20 million of them, not 3.5 million like here in the States, 20 million. So the landowners were compensated up front. The serfs got some land. And over a period of time, the purpose of the plan was that as they worked on that land, a part of the profit would essentially be a tax to pay back the state for giving the money to the landowners up front to free the serfs. Now, eventually, of course, there was a revolution, but that was some 50 years later. This freedom of the emancipating the serfs happened without any war, and it was planned. Lincoln and the Republican Party made no plan for taking care of the blacks. And as a result, they stayed in the South. And it's really what the Northerners wanted to accomplish. They wanted the blacks to remain quarantined in the South. 35 years after the war had ended, over 90% of America's blacks lived in the South. There was not much migration, natural migration, into the northern states and then increasingly the western states, because those states didn't want it. Despite the fact, you would think that if they were truly free, given the greater economic opportunities in the northern states and in the western states, that the blacks would naturally migrate to them. But no, that didn't happen. And that didn't happen because Northerners didn't want it. Every state that entered the United States after Texas in 1845, which was 175 years ago, every single one of them, except for West Virginia, entered with tiny black populations, typically around 1% or less. West Virginia had about 5% of its population as blacks. This was really what the North was, one of the objectives, one of the war aims of the North. Keep the blacks quarantined in the South. We don't want them up here, and we don't want them in the Western territories. Those are the facts. The facts are consistent with that argument. Okay, so I think what I would sort of summarize with here is the Democrats are committing patricide. Jackson was the founder of their party, and they're killing him. They don't realize that they're flying high now because they have stood on the shoulders of giants from the past. Isaac Newton recognized that when he made his great scientific discoveries of the 3 laws of motion. He said, if I can see further, it's only because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. The Democrat Party today is narcissistic enough to believe that they've accomplished everything. Their current power is completely a result of their beliefs and what they've accomplished. They don't realize, will never recognize that they're standing on the giants from the past. So let me conclude with, in the past, I've shown you some books that I've published that you can buy, and I will autograph them. But instead of going through all that and giving you my email address and everything, just go to Amazon.com, look for my books. My last name is spelled Leigh, and my first name is Phil. And I'm going to put autograph copies for sale on eBay. So you don't have to contact me or anything. You can just go to eBay and buy them. And if I'm the seller, then there'll be autographed copies. Okay, that's our show today. Thanks for watching.